This lesson is about standard landings, which are often called normal landings, and this is how most of your non-pilot passengers are going to decide whether they think you're a good pilot or not. In previous lessons, we talked about how you control an airplane when you're on the ground and how you control an airplane in flight. So a landing is all about making the transition between these two regimes. When you first start learning how to do landings, your instructor will start teaching you a standard landing technique. After you get proficient with standard landings, then your instructor will start introducing you to a couple types of specialty landings. There are 3 lessons about landings in this ground school program. This lesson covers standard landings in an airplane with tricycle landing gear. There's another lesson that talks about some special techniques you need to use if you're going to use tailwheel landing gear. And then a third lesson talks about specialty landings. I'll begin by talking about 5 stages of a landing. Then I'm going to talk about how you correct for a crosswind, which means a wind blowing from one side of the runway toward the other side. Then I'll talk about some techniques you can use to accommodate gusty winds. Finally, I'll talk about aborted landings, which are called go-arounds. A standard landing is the technique that you're going to use when you have a long, smooth runway. The goal with a standard landing is to make the landing comfortable for your passengers, easy on the aircraft, and you want to keep as many options open as possible for unusual situations that might arise during the process. A standard landing has a series of phases called the final approach, the round out, the flare, touchdown, and then roll out. I'll cover each of these one at a time. When you get down to about 300 feet of the ground, you want to be in something called a stabilized approach. A stabilized approach means that you're lined up with the runway, your speed is at the right target speed, which is called VREF, and your angle to the runway, your approach angle, is suitable. Your instructor will tell you which speed works best in the airplane you're using. Typically, VREF is about 1.3 times the stall speed. Only small speed and descent angle adjustments should be needed once you're in that stabilized approach. If you get into a situation where you need to make any large changes, then you should consider going around. So you make speed adjustments by changing your pitch attitude. You may recall from the primary controls lesson that when you make a pitch change, there's a transient effect and a lasting effect. So when you raise the nose, there will be a transient effect where you go to a shallower descent angle, and lowering the nose has a transient effect of increasing your descent angle. But once the speed changes, the lasting effect may be the opposite of that. So pulling back on the stick and raising the nose may ultimately cause you to be descending faster. But the reason you're changing pitch attitude is to make the speed be what you want. You'll judge your descent angle by looking at something called an aiming point, a point on the runway that you're descending towards. If you're on the right path, then your aiming point appear stationary in the windscreen. You adjust the descent angle with power changes. So a standard landing approach will usually be made with some power above idle so that you're able to make adjustments in either direction. You can decrease it or increase it. In most aircraft, using full flap deflection works best during the final approach. So to illustrate this a little bit, here's a side view of a standard final approach. The dotted blue line here is the nominal approach path. That's what you're on average going for. And you select a nominal approach path and an aiming point that's a ways down the runway. That guarantees that if you were to have an engine failure while you're on your approach, your power off glide path, which would be steeper, will still result in you being able to make it to the runway. So when you're flying down this nominal approach path, that aiming point stays at the same place in your windscreen. Now let's consider a situation where you're too high on approach. In this situation, if you're at the nominal power level and you're descending at the nominal angle, you would overfly your aiming point. You'll observe this by noticing that that aiming point is moving down the windscreen. To correct for that, you need to reduce the power setting enough so that the aiming point becomes stationary in the windscreen. When you do that, you will be descending at a steeper than nominal angle, but you'll be descending towards your aiming point again. The opposite happens if you're too low. So if you're too low and you're moving along at your nominal power setting, you would not make it to your aiming point. And you'll notice that because the aiming point will appear to be moving up on the windscreen. So to adjust that, you add power. That will cause you to approach at a shallower angle and reach your aiming point. Now, if you're very far out on final approach, it may be worthwhile to overcorrect a little bit and try to get back to that nominal point or that nominal approach path. If you're close in, it's better off to just make a single correction and go straight to your aiming point. The round out is where we transition from that descent of the final approach to level flight a couple of feet above the runway. We accomplish that transition by smoothly pulling back on the yoke or the stick, starting about 15 to 20 feet above the ground. That will, how high above you the ground you start will depend a little bit on what type of aircraft you're learning in. Once we start that round out, we need to shift our control rules. We're no longer using pitch to control speed and power to control our descent rate. Now we're using pitch to control the descent. And we really are only thinking about those transient effects of pitch because the round out and the flare are transient events and we won't be in them long enough for the lasting effects of a pitch change to take effect. Judging your height is best done by looking down the runway, a few thousand feet. With practice, you get better at judging your height and deciding when to start that round out and how hard you need to pull. It gets easier if you make nice, consistent final approaches. Of course, that also is a thing you're just learning at the same time you're learning to do good round outs. When you start going to different runways that are bigger or smaller, or you start flying at night, some of the visual cues that you use to judge when to start your round out will be different, and you'll have to do some relearning to be able to make nice round outs at those different airports. So the goal during the flare is to stay a couple of feet off the ground while the airplane slows down. So as the airplane is slowing down, you need to be gradually increasing that pitch angle in order to maintain your height. If you start to climb a little, then you should just hold the pitch attitude that you're at until the aircraft starts descending a little bit, and then resume your gradual pulling back. Again, it's important to look down the runway to judge your height. Looking off to the sides will tend to make it difficult for you to judge your height, and the altimeter isn't accurate enough for judging a couple feet. You can reduce the power to idle during the flare. There's really no more need for power once you get to this point. Instructors will differ a little bit from one another on when they want you to reduce power. Some will say you shouldn't reduce power before you start your round out. So once you have a pitch attitude established that is an acceptable pitch attitude for touchdown, then you stop that gradual pulling back and you let the aircraft settle down onto the main wheels. So what do I mean by an acceptable attitude? You want it to be nose high by enough that that nose wheel is going to stay off the ground as your main gear touch down. The fact that the center of gravity is a little in front of the main wheels means that it's going to tend to pitch down after your main wheels hit. You really want to avoid the situation where you either land on your nose wheel or where your nose wheel comes down hard after the main wheels hit. To do a full stall landing, what you do is you continue trying to hold the airplane off basically until it's not possible anymore, until the stick or the yoke are all the way back and you just can't hold it off the runway anymore. Doing that minimizes the touchdown speed, and it's beneficial in some situations and in some aircraft. Other aircraft do a little better if you land a little faster than the full stall landing. When you do it well, then you have a very low vertical speed as the main wheels touch down. They're just very gradually dropping onto the runway. While you're learning, you'll experience some landings that don't fit that description. So at the point of touchdown, your landing gear will cushion that transition a little bit. Aircraft landing gear design varies from one aircraft to another, and some aircraft provide a lot of cushioning and others provide only a little bit. The tires themselves provide cushioning. Big diameter, low pressure tires provide a lot of cushioning, whereas the small, high pressure tires provide very little. On some aircraft, the tires themselves are really the only thing that provides any cushioning. In this case, this illustrated examples, there's a bungee cord arrangement in the landing gear that allows the wheels to move apart from one another and absorb some energy that way. This is an example of an oleo strut landing gear where the tire moves closer to the airplane as it lands and compresses some fluid, which absorbs energy, and it has the nice characteristic of not springing you back up. This landing gear design is called trailing link landing gear, where there's a linkage that the landing gear can pivot about so that the aircraft is, which is a little bit in front of the tires. Here's an example of spring steel landing gear, which deflects as it absorbs energy, and because it's very springy, it has the characteristic of tending to bounce you back up into the air if you have very much vertical speed when you land. So different types of landing gear can really impact how difficult it is to make that smooth touchdown and not get bounced back up into the air. The final part of the landing process is the rollout. So after you have the aircraft rolling along on the main wheels, you should gradually lower the nose wheel to the ground. You do this by releasing the back pressure a little bit. You shouldn't be pushing the nose wheel into the ground. You really want to ease the weight onto the nose wheel. Once the airplane's on all three wheels, once the nose wheel is down, then you use your brakes together, both left and right together, to whatever extent you need to in order to make the turnoff you're trying to make. You don't want to use them excessively hard. Now let's talk about how we correct for a crosswind. And this is applicable whether the landing gear is tricycle or tailwheel. So in most phases of flight, the way we handle a crosswind is by changing our heading so that our heading is into the wind a little bit compared to the direction that we want to move with respect to the ground. When we're landing, we want the direction of the nose to be pointed the same direction that the aircraft is moving. So the way we accomplish that is a side slip. So the airplane will actually be flying somewhat sideways with respect to the air in order that we keep the nose pointed in the same direction as it's moving across the ground. So let's talk a little bit more about how we do these side slips. So when we're on short final, we establish the side slip by lowering whichever wing is into the wind and using the opposite rudder. So if the wind is from our left, we will lower the left wing and use some right rudder. If the wind is from the right, we will lower the right wing and use some left rudder. We'll use enough rudder to keep our nose aligned with the runway. When we're first learning, it's good to establish the slip quite a ways up the final approach path. That gives us lots of time to make adjustments and get the correct amount of side slip established. As you get more proficient, you'll probably start doing it later on in the final approach process. So getting the right amount of side slip is accomplished by guessing how much you need and then making corrections if you observe that it's too much or too little. So if you find that you're drifting downwind from the center line of the runway, then you need to increase the amount of side slip, increase the bank and the rudder. If you find yourself drifting upwind, then you've put in too much side slip. You need to decrease the bank a little bit. So you want to continue this side slip through the round out and the flare. There's a tendency of students to get the side slip all set up, and then when you start doing the round out and flare, you just let the wings go level. But you need to get in the habit of continuing it all the way through the flare. You use the other controls the same way as you would without a crosswind. When you touch down, that bank angle will go away because once your wheels are on the ground, the angle of the ground is what determines your bank angle. But you'll continue using your ailerons into the wind like you would when you're taxiing in order to have wind pick up that upwind wing. The winds are not constant. On gusty days, the wind speed and the wind direction are both changing from one moment to the next. As a result of those wind changes, your airspeed will be changing and you may find yourself drifting off the runway. So the most vulnerable time in gusty winds is if you're very close to stall speed but still in the air. That's when the wind changes have the biggest effect, and it's also when your controls are least effective at making a correction. So there's a few ways that you avoid spending a lot of time in that situation. One is to add half of the gust factor to your normal approach speed. So during your final approach and your round out and the first part of your flare, you've got a little extra speed, making your controls a little more effective at making corrections for gusts. In many airplanes, it's better to use partial flaps in gusty conditions as opposed to full flaps. That will allow you to touch down at a higher airspeed than you would with full flaps, but still be in that nose high appropriate attitude for a touchdown. In gusty winds, it's often better to touch down before you get to stall speed as opposed to doing the full stall type landing where you hold it off as long as possible. And then finally, don't hesitate to go around if a gust gets you in a bad time and you find yourself in a bad situation. No point trying to save the landing in that situation. Go ahead and go around. The next time you come down, your luck will probably be better and the gust won't hit you at such a vulnerable point in time. Speaking of go-arounds, that's our next topic. So there's a number of reasons why you may want to abandon an attempt to land and go around the pattern to make another attempt. One reason is that you just misjudged something. You either ended up too high or too low or off course, off speed. Something just wasn't right when you were supposed to be stabilized on final approach. So go around, try again, get it right the next time. Another is if at any point during the landing you see something on or near the runway that would make a landing unsafe. It could be another aircraft taxied onto the runway that you were expecting it was going to wait for you, or maybe you thought that they were far enough ahead that they'd be off the runway by the time you got there, and it turned out they took longer than you thought they would. Or an animal runs on the runway. Lots of things can happen where you get close to landing and decide, no, I shouldn't land right now. And then, as we were just discussing, if a wind gust puts you in a bad position at some point, you should do a go around and try again. This is not a complete list. So, whatever caused you to have to do a go around, you need to quickly change your mindset from thinking about landing to kind of having your brain in a takeoff mindset and transition to the initial climb phase of a takeoff, which we discussed in the lesson on takeoffs. There's a number of things you need to do, and you should do them in this order. The first thing is add power, full power. And if you had carburetor heat on, you want to take the carburetor heat off because that limits your power. Then you want to get to the right airspeed for initial climb. Usually that's VY. That often is going to mean you're going to need to lower the nose compared to the attitude that you were in when you were approaching for landing. So if the reason you're doing a go-around was because there was some sort of a conflict with another aircraft, then you may want to alter your course in order to avoid that conflict, left or, move left or right of the runway, usually to the right. If there's an aircraft taking off, you want to be away from the center line of the runway. Once you've established that positive rate of climb, then it's time to think about things like whether your flaps and your landing gear are in the desired position for initial climb and to change them if they're not. If you're going to reconfigure your flaps, you should do it gradually. You don't want to dump the flaps from full to 0 all at once. You want to go a notch at a time if they're manual flaps. And you can retrim to be trimmed for climb instead of trimmed for landing. After you've done all those things, that's the time to make a radio call and announce that you've done a go-around. That completes the lesson on standard landings. There are some things you should talk about with your flight instructor while you're learning landings and as you move farther in your training. First, is there anything unique about the aircraft you're using or about the airport that you're learning at that would call for a different standard landing procedure than the one that I've discussed here? And then during your solo flying, your instructor will be approving your flights on a flight-by-flight basis. But as you get close to taking your check ride, it would be good to have a discussion with your flight instructor about what kind of personal limits you should be setting for yourself regarding runway length, crosswinds, and maximum gust factors.